by their homes. It completely supports class division. It's built into the structure. And number 5, habitat and resource mismanagement, in other words, pollution and depletion, such as peak oil and things like that. All right, number 1, wealth imbalance. I think we all know the stats by now. We have 1% of the world's population owning 40% of the planet's wealth. We have 400 Americans with more wealth than 150 million combined. Put a different way, a stat I realized recently was that 50% of Americans only have 2.5% of America's wealth, which I thought that was equally as dramatic. On a different level, almost half of the world, 3 billion people, now live on less than $2 a day, and one out of every 2 children are impoverished. 50% of all children are in fact impoverished on that level. While in wealthy America, over 21% of children are actually below the poverty line now. And as an aside, if you research what the poverty line is, I believe it's $21,000 for a family of 4. Try living on $21,000 for a single individual, and then think about the fact that the U.S. puts that label, that line as a family of 4, which is completely insane. So you can extrapolate what real poverty actually is if you do some calculations about living standards. And as such depressing stats go on, I would summarize this issue globally by saying that someone starves to death every 3.6 seconds on this planet. As Gandhi stated, the most deadly form of violence is poverty. And the question is why? I would like to actually ask 2 questions to support the why factor. What are the factors that contribute to poverty and deprivation? And 2, does the existence of poverty and deprivation serve a beneficial role with respect to our current economic model? The common myth about poverty is that there's not enough food, there's too many people, and our production methods just are not efficient enough, apparently, to meet the needs. Well, if anyone takes a moment, they can find that there's no evidence to support any of those conclusions. We have ever-increasing production efficiency, even with the old methods we're still using, not to mention the amazing methods that are on the horizon. And we already produce many more calories today, which could easily feed well over the current population. So the problem is not technical. The problem is clearly economic. And while poverty organizations continue to point out various effects that create poverty, such as commodity prices or the national debts or austerity or economic decline or healthcare costs in the sense of relative poverty and job loss, etc. Rarely are the very mechanics of our economic system brought into question. With regard to the second question, not only does this system generate poverty and a growing wealth divide by its inherent mechanisms and internal logic, it actually gains advantage from that deprivation in order to perpetuate itself. Let me ask you all, who were the first laborers in the market exchange model historically? Slaves. Slaves, in the view of the market, meant the ability to reduce costs for the producer. In modern terminology, it's called cost efficiency. In order for competing producers to seek profit, acquire profit, they must cut their costs by whatever means they can so they can be competitive. When you see sweatshop slavery in the world, or illegal immigrants being exploited for labor, or citizens, like many of us in America, buried in debt, trapped in low-paying jobs that firmly are not liked, without health insurance or any type of general social support, often with the inability to even attend a university, you are seeing the logic of the market model at its finest. The key word here is scarcity. The general scarcity of goods and resources means higher value, less affordability. And a general scarcity of income and labor means more demand, more deprivation, and hence cheaper labor, thus exploitation. I hope that makes sense. Put another way, the system would not be able to operate if any kind of basic balance with human needs being met. Scarcity is required to keep cost efficiency going and product value high. 2 elements that continue to reinforce people's inability to get what they need. In the words of economist Marshall Sahlins, The market industrial system institutes scarcity in a manner completely unparalleled and to a degree nowhere else approximated, where production and distribution are arranged through the behavior of prices, and all livelihoods depend on getting and spending. Insufficiency of material means becomes the explicit, calculable starting point of all economic activity. And while today in the activist community, many people, again, as I addressed Occupy Wall Street, they talk about the removal of debt, the removal of interest, more legislation to outlaw slave labor and create higher fixed wages for the world's people to get their basic needs, raising minimum wage. They don't seem to understand that the system as we know it would basically collapse if such measures were taken. Can some improvement be made? Yes, but the flawed root problem logic that I keep hinting to still remains. Public health, number 2. For the sake of this presentation, let's talk about public health regarding physical health and mental health. As far as physical health, have you ever noticed that you have to go out of your way and at increased expense to buy food that isn't poisoned with additives and hormones and preservatives and grotesque levels of fat and sugar? That the idea of good health is almost a bad word. It's almost held in contempt by industry. I'm always amused when I go to a store and I see things like green or natural or organic, as though there ever should have been anything else produced. I mean, they might as well just put less poisonous, more poisonous, really poisonous. Cancer deaths have nothing but increased around the world. And while people demand more testing, of course, in the consumer culture for chemical agents, and they demand more more clean production elements and all the like, still no one is actually complaining about the fact that the market system and its inherent interest to simply get more for less, to increase profits, is the incentive source of nearly all the public health issues in this regard. I used to live in Bushwick, Brooklyn, in a very poor neighborhood, and in the grocery store there, I would often be behind people that were on food stamps. Now, their limited financial ability, coupled probably with a lack of education, enabled them to buy nothing but ramen noodles and basically Pepsi every single day. That's all they fed on. They are poor, and they didn't know any better, but the poverty element is really the largest attribute. If you don't have the means to gain decent quality food, you know, the rationality is obvious. I don't need to explain it. But I couldn't believe I'd see whole grocery carts full of the worst possible food processed you could find. So you can see how, again, it's class perpetuation. The poor are not just poor. They're inhibited by all sorts of means that reduce their health, both physical and mental. And I will talk in a moment about the work of Richard Wilkinson, who did these exquisite studies on how the very nature of stratification is actually unhealthy for all of us. And the more poor you are, the more that stress will generate all sorts of diseases, both, again, physical and mental. But hey, that's okay, right? Because lung cancer, diabetes treatments create jobs. They create economic growth. They create GDP. I hope everyone firmly understands that. From an economic perspective, sick people needing servicing are great. Think about it. There is nothing to gain economically by the resolution of any given problem on any level. It is the maintaining and servicing of problems that underlies actual economic growth. As an aside, you might notice how market economists, when you engage them, they tend to justify this system with these blanket statements. And often they'll say, the market economy, it simply makes available services to those who need them in the free economy, demand and supply. So if you need your car's shocks replaced, you just hire a mechanic to do it. However, you rarely hear them turn the other side on this. The view ignores the fact that the mechanic that replaces your shocks needs you to come and give them work. And at what point, in desperation of scarcity, does such a person justify, say, selling shoddy shocks, which will wear out faster, just so they can get more work? Now, people will immediately say, oh, that's just immoral, that's unethical. But that is a truly relative notion here. For no producer is actually able to produce the best anything in a market system, because the cost efficiency mechanism that defines the nature of maintaining profitability in a competitive market, simply cutting corners to make sure you produce something just affordable enough, but not high quality enough where you lose market share because others are competing with you. I hope that makes sense. The very act of doing that produces inferior products right off the bat. Even if they attempted to make the best, they can't within the very dynamics of what the market system does. This computer I have right here will die approximately 3 years after I buy it. It's made of all sorts of very cheap components that are extremely faulty, and it's an estimation game that they play to make sure. It's called intrinsic obsolescence. It's built into the market system. Everything produced by all corporate sources are inherently flawed and inferior the moment they're created because it is mathematically impossible in a market economy to produce the best. You wouldn't be able to compete. It'd be too expensive because the nature of the system increases prices as the resource values increase. So I can't reiterate that enough. So a mechanic engaging in what you call planned obsolescence, doing a poor job so you come back, or giving you a poor, faulty product, is just an extension of the very nature of what this system does inherently. So where is the moral judgment there? Only a matter of degree. The system thrives on the servicing of problems is my main point in this. I'll be on that tangent. You don't want to solve problems. You want to keep them. So keep that in mind. It's about money, not health or sustainability. Coming to mental health, the amount of people on antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs seems to continue to rise as well. Why? The key word is stress, as most psychologists would point out one way or another. Stress is a deadly killer and the fuel of most mental health problems we see, driven by environmental conditions. Even those studies on genetically induced mental health disorders are almost universally triggered by some type of stress response in youth of the child or even in adulthood. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see how, as we've all experienced stress in our lives, how it can create neurotic behavior. It can cause all sorts of shutdowns within our emotional spectrum. It can make us erratic, and it easily lead to depression, which I think probably everyone on the planet has experienced at one point or another. So we have these incredibly stressful societies that we've created based on this system. And the survival itself, really, if you think about it, in the larger context, which I can't go into, we have created almost an idiotically stressful environment that isn't even necessary. Since the market model at its root is based on this imbalance. It's based on stratification. It's based on scarcity, which creates stress and then creates mental health problems. Again, I could go on lots of big tangents here. For example, absolute pressure. Money worries are the #1 cause of stress in general. And of course, why wouldn't they be? Stats have been run since the beginning of this economic collapse and found a correlation with suicide rates, in fact. People tend to value themselves also by their job. And they lose their sense of value when they lose their job. And there are a number of reports in the past few years of people who actually killed others and their entire families just because they lost their jobs. Is this really necessary? I mean, there might be inhibiting attributes built into these psychologies to begin with, but the stress of this system is really pushing people to extremes. In a world where we can create an abundance of the necessities of life, to provide a peace of mind for everyone, knowing that they don't have to starve, or no one in their family is going to starve, that it isn't based on this cutthroat social Darwinism based on a totally faulty traditional notion that there simply isn't enough to go around. Is this psychological consequence really necessary to endure? And then we have relative pressure. Not the direct pressure of being broke or losing your job, but the relative pressure. And this comes in the form of psychosocial stress, as I alluded to earlier. And this is about stress that is caused by how people think about themselves and their status, which is a cultural notion, with respect to others. An enormous amount of data exists on this issue by a man named Richard Wilkinson. And what he's found is that the larger the income gap between the people in a society, the higher the level of all sorts of debilitating mental and health disorders, not to mention violence and crime. Basically, there's a form of stress that's emerged because we're such social organisms. We are deeply social. If there's anything you could say it's built into our human nature is we're deeply social. If you have a child that's born and that child is not touched, that child will die. It doesn't matter if that child is fed. Doesn't matter if that child is in a good home, so to speak, shelter. If there's no contact with humans, the child will die. It's built into us. We're social. And this has manifested itself with the stratification attribute, where you can turn on the TV and see somebody with a 50-room mansion and 2 jets parked in their front lawn, and you've been conditioned by your general culture that that's what success is. And then you begin to feel stress for that, and it causes all sorts of neurotic behavior, science has found. The bottom line, in fact, is that our class system, which is a natural byproduct, almost a defining attribute of our economic model, appears to be literally unhealthy by its very manifestation. This is, again, traditional notions clashing with emergent knowledge. People say to me, oh, you're against classes, you must be a Marxist and a communist. I say, no, I'm against classes because it's scientifically unhealthy for a society to behave this way. If you want to live in a safe society with less murder rates, less mental health diseases, basically less everything that's negative, we have to get balance and equality and egalitarianism going. It's a scientific reality. Number 3, labor. It's interesting to me how many, especially in the Occupy movement, as I was addressing earlier this weekend, and across the world, obviously, with numerous uprisings and destabilizations, that the labor issue is a focal point where people are complaining to their governments to say, where are our jobs? You're not doing enough to give us jobs. As though really governments have anything to do with that element of the market system. They're yelling to the wind. The first thing everyone needs to understand is that the only thing that has put any of us out of work in the broad view has been technology. Why? Because technology is increasingly becoming more cost efficient for corporations. Some economists will argue, and I get these arguments all the time, that technological progress works on both sides. It replaces human labor on one side, and it creates new labor through new mediums on the other. And while that might have been true in the past, before the exponential increase started to really accelerate, technology is now leaving us in the dust. Our brains and our abilities and our learning processes are simply not fast enough to keep up with what is enabled now by this beautiful thing that we've created, which is information and physical technological development. It's incredible. These are extensions. It really challenges the very basis of what we're doing. The more we mechanize, the more productive we become. In other words, the more people replaced systematically by machines, the more output potential and not to apply technological automation in every single field imaginable if we want a society that's actually producing more, that can create an abundance, that can actually meet needs. It's completely irrational for us not to be doing this. This means, literally, that it's time for us to grow out of the labor for income system as we know it. It's completely obsolete. It's not only becoming more and more inefficient, it simply isn't going to be able to keep the majority of people employed on this planet. And the fact that corporations will continue to mechanize, again, for our coveted cost efficiency, we can't win. Ray Kurzweil did a great stat where he talked about the exponential increase of application of technology and the dramatic cost reduction of this technology. Where a calculator, when it was first invented, I believe, was around $600 a number of decades ago. Now you can be lucky to even pay for one because you can get them for free. So as these two issues continue to develop, the question becomes, and this is the defense actually by most economists, they say, oh, well, the decrease in the cost of technology enables us to produce more and hence create more with less cost. But there's absolutely no one-to-one correlation there that I've found. You can't assume in a market environment that's based on profit and maximization strategically, by the way, that they're somehow going to be lenient and start to charge exactly less based on the proportion of what they gain through using technological applications. I hope that makes sense. It's completely irrational to think that way because the motives are against it. But that's usually what economists say. And all I say is, well, look around you. The only reason people are unemployed on this planet is because they've been replaced by technology, period. And I mean over the broad scheme of history. If we all want to go back to being agrarian farmers, I guarantee we'll all be employed. Do you really want to do that? Or on the other side of the spectrum, just to continue my tangent, we could all go to Facebook and get Facebook money. And we could all do little things on Facebook. Is that where you want your new economy to be? I mean, these are the things I hear from economists. They say, well, we're just going to develop a whole new sector where it's all digital and there'll be information and people are going to sell and buy information, as though that's really necessary. You know what I mean? Is that why you want to live your life, just to save this system? So, coming back to this, there are only 3 things right now that will create more jobs in the broad scheme. One, we have to cut the workday so others can fill in, which, by the way, was proposed during the Roosevelt administration, the Great Depression, and hideously opposed, as he was called, a socialist. Two, we stop mechanization, which, by the way, was also proposed during the Roosevelt administration. They actually submitted a bill that wanted to stop invention, which I thought was just the most hilarious thing ever. Or, as I just alluded to, we create a sea of completely arbitrary occupations and condition the culture to support them as relevant. I don't know, like two things that have recently come about: advertising and Wall Street, two utterly meaningless occupations that do nothing, create nothing, contribute nothing, and actually support the opposite values that will continue sustainability and progress. Yet Wall Street and advertising are some of the biggest sectors, well, industries on the face of the earth as far as how much money they circulate and take in. So if that isn't a sign of where we're heading, I'm not sure what is. The bottom line, as far as I'm concerned, is that the labor for income system, which is the foundation of the market economy, is becoming obsolete, and we could either adapt and change the system as this emergence unfolds, compensate for it, or it's going to simply collapse on itself. As far as things are going right now, the jobs are not coming back. I don't see them coming back. I have no idea how they're possibly going to come back because everything moves against the application of human employment right now. Number 4, the financial system. This is a short one. As we all know, debt and interest are inventions, rules of a game we have concocted for ourselves over time. However, the consequences of this game, of course, are extremely real as we play, and the well-being of entire nations are now in question due to their existence. I'm not going to go into all the bank bailout stuff and the austerity measures or the fact that we charge interest on money to loan it that doesn't even exist in the money supply, making a debt black hole, if you will, that is literally mathematically impossible to get out of. I hope everyone here knows that. If you look at these maps of debt, that's why they're there. But my question to you is, which is a new one posing, how do you operate a market system without interest and debt? This is something that struck me recently. When you think about the mechanics of the system, how can it work without interest and debt? If money isn't loaned at interest as a